Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm very grateful to all of you who pay attention to my posts, and especially those of you who like or share them. And particularly my patrons, few though they are. You make a lot of light in my life and help me to have the freedom to keep doing this work, this joyful creativity, these explorations. So I'm really grateful, particularly to my longtime supporter H and my new supporter C. And you know, if you have a little something that you can spare each month, $1, $2, it's fine, whatever you've got. That'll help me keep producing this content and keeping it real on the internet. Circa 2024. My motto for this year is that 2024 isn't a year. The last year we will ever have as human beings around here for the foreseeable future was 2023. And this dumpster fire of insanity that we are presently experiencing is actually not a year at all. In fact, and you know, your mileage may vary. I'm pretty sure that things aren't things anymore. All that stuff we used to think we knew what that was, or what was going on, or what would happen next, or who was who, or all of that knowledge thing and knowing stuff, that's all gone. Poof. Mushroom cloud of over the over the horizon of identity. And in some ways, that's wonderful, because a lot of the whatness and the isness and all that was broken. But in other ways, we don't have any kind of ship that we can ride in together, because we really never forged a we in the first place, except on very small scales. And we didn't go around building ships either. And, you know, by that I just mean a trustworthy vehicle of purposive orientation together. Almost all of the potentials of our communal relationships and behavior has been thoroughly, recursively recolonized by the Thrisp-like, dead inside, infinitely hungry processes that establish themselves in the human cognitium, the network of human minds. If we don't do the necessary bonding,
they show it. They do. Every time they say thank you so much.
if we don't do the necessary engineering of our relationships with history, the sky, nature, the living places, the plants, animals, and insects, the ancestors, are dreaming, and what I will loosely refer to as the angels, the non-human intelligences, the accessible non-human intelligences above the human cognition, that have been lost to us, lost to our direct contact and experience for so long, even though most of us probably were born with these relationships intact, and they may have stayed intact briefly during the earliest phases of our human incarnation, childhood, infancy, and stuff. But that stuff gets, well, what does it get? It rarely it poorly survives the processes of enlanguaging and enculturation, which our parents and peers impose on us, believing that to be some wonderful inheritance. And the problem there is that it could be. If it were rich and veritable and ancient and true, the processes of enlanguaging and enculturation would not be so violent, so dissociative, malignly dissociative, so isolating, so terrifying, so confusing. But unfortunately, us moderns, with very few exceptions, I mean, the world... Now, let's be clear about something. When I make very general statements about the humans, I'm making a bad mistake, and it's one that I've pointed out many times. I am making a mistake I would call generalizing the worst common denominator over the manifold. So the manifold is all the different living places and humans presently alive on Earth. And the generalization is that they're all modern. Well, a lot of them aren't, and each of the cohorts we might explore or contact or come into actual relationship with rather than just thinking about them, right? And this is the problem with abstract thought. We can dissociatively pretend to be in relationships we don't have. And then from there, we can evaluate the resulting abstractions, and this obliterates our intelligence, right? It's like a snuff film of the possibilities of actually understanding or relating with. The little children are painting, and their paintings are amazing. So beautiful and colorful. And see, in those little children, all of this worst common denominator stuff is not yet established. They are still alive inside. And there are many exceptions, beautiful exceptions, to this worst common denominator evaluative behavior, misbehavior. That I'm concerned about. And we should celebrate and recognize the exceptions. Yes, the bell curve. Yes, the averages. And yes, they're devastating because their defection, the capacity to defect from our humanity, to colonize and recolonize, to devastate, to I'm looking for a neologism here. It means to cause, to viciously impose forgetting, to anamnese, or no, to amnese, to it's funny. The terrible weapons of colonization, and this word gets, overused these days for all kinds of things, but what I'm talking about is when the possibility of coherent human relation, intelligence, conservation of ancestral land, places, living places, intimate symbiosis of humans with the earth and the waters and the sky, which is rarely approaches perfection, but in many places actually became coherent and beautiful and was sustained over time. And colonization is sort of, I remember a bad cartoon, maybe from the early 80s, called Godzilla Meets Bambi. And there's just, you see Bambi's hanging out, and then suddenly, boom, there's just a footprint. And then Bambi's smushed in the bottom of that footprint. And that's, that's a cartoonish image. But the forces of colonization rose in peoples, in cohorts, in societies, in nations, that were self-colonizing. And this is part of the problem that is overlooked when we blame history on bad people, and particularly when we take the convenient exit door and think, oh, yeah, it's patriarchy. It's those males dominating things and slapping them with their generative organ, crushing them. And while that's not untrue, the secret origins of these problems are preserved against our discovery when we make convenient indictments. Because if we want to understand how it might be possible for us in our time and our children's time to establish actually coherent, intelligent human societies worthy of survival, never mind capable of self-sustainment, but virtuously beautiful in spirit and purpose and behavior, then we're going to need a much better array of toys array of perspectival toys with which to examine what led to the problems we face today. And, the common the common figurines that we like to, that are often selected for admonition and indictment and elevation in our awareness to the status of culprits are monotheism, patriarchy, commerce, commodity commerce, class, hierarchical class dichotomies, the 1%, the wealthy, the kings and queens, particularly in various phases of the development of Europe and the Middle East. I don't know, personally I'm not well educated enough historically to understand the real birthplaces of the colonizing virus I love the cadences of German. It's wonderful to hear people enthusiastically speaking German as they walk past me. And, we might think, oh, what synchronicity. Nazism, colonization. Yeah, go ahead, think what you like. But try to understand that what I'm saying is we don't have the formula yet. That stuff we're exchanging around like a new kind of poison in the atmosphere of what we have ironically called social justice is not the elixir, nor is it the intoxicant that will give us insight. If we want insight, we're going to have to authentically go back, not merely into the history of our species, but very carefully into the history of our own lives. Your life, my life, our childhood, the transitions, the phases of colonization that we ourselves underwent as little children, that our parents underwent, that our grandparents underwent, because I would like you to suspect with me that not only is the key to the cage hidden, the keys to the cages, not only is it hidden in the arc of our developmental experience, individually and collectively, uniquely, keys in each one of us have been secreted, secreted, obscured, occulted. But something even stranger is real and accessible to us, which is that through a process that resembles something we don't have a good word for, and I'm disinclined to forge a convenient neologism here because I want a really good one. So I'll describe instead of label. In the same way that geologists look at the strata, the layers, in places where they have been laid bare to our access on the land. The only really good example I have at hand, easily accessible, is the Grand Canyon. A place where a furrow has been dug by a river into the physical body of geologic time. And so the strata are laid bare, and I guess the other more destructive and I think confusing way to try to get at this information, or these recordings, if you will, these memories, is with core samples. You carefully drill a tube, you extract tubes of earth and stone and ice and stuff in a sequence going down, and then you can lay them out in a linear fashion and examine the record. But what I'm trying to say, what I'm implying here, is that and similarly with the origin of life branch of sciences, and paleontology, where we look in the various strata for, quote, evidence, which I think is I'd love to know the etymology of this word right now. We look for evidence of the previously existing phases of life and development that we imagine took place linearly, because we are addicted to one thing mind, we are addicted to linear perspectives. We don't have to be. We can break out of that. It's one of the things we need to. We need the experience of being liberated from. So there are these strata in the stone, in the earth, that are like memorial dreaming traces in a way. And what I'm suggesting is that in each one of us, and in our cohorts, in our cultures, in our ethnicities, in our ancestors, in our progeny, there's a layered richness of interiority that actually contains the entire history of our species. There's a way of doing a kind of archaeology that isn't merely objective, isn't merely empirical, that is partly magical or partly transcendental. You know? And when you hear stories, for example, of either accidental enlightenment, where you have some young child who at 6 just starts sitting still and won't move and has to be fed, and some guru comes and says, oh, this one has gone beyond. And when you hear stories of intentional enlightenment where, quote unquote, right, where someone very committed to the meditation path, mostly you will hear similar stories where, in fact, what I'm speaking about surfaces in consciousness. Thus we hear the Buddha saying something, I don't know what the Buddha actually said, but we hear stories that the Buddha said I have been billions of lives. I have been all of the beings, in a way. This might be translated as past lives. But I strongly suspect that the actual situation is much weirder than past lives, and is not linear in the ways we would imagine. So that, for example, imagine, just as an example, that you are alive locally to your consciousness right now, but like a constellation in the sky. Imagine, for example, the Big Dipper as seen from Earth. Those stars, the shape of the Big Dipper is seen from a point in space. Now, I would like to know the names of those stars and how distant in space-time they are from each other, because let's be clear, if you saw it from another angle outside of it, it would not form a dipper. Some of the stars might be invisible, or there might be other stars that were visible in the arrangement. The illusion, it's not actually an illusion, is it? The figuration of the Big Dipper is, we experience it because of where we are looking from in time-space. And so to us, it's a little bit as if there's a, dot-to-dot drawing there, which over time has undergone semantic degradation, so that we think of it as a ladle cup. Because I promise you, whatever the original, long ago they were not thinking that's a ladle cup. They probably didn't think that what was seen in the sky resembled objects, appliances, or tools. That would be a very unlikely derivation, I think. So we should take that seriously, the unlikeliness of such a derivation. I mean, hilariously, a couple nights ago I woke up from dreaming, just to give you a sort of related example. And I don't really know what was going on. And it was sort of hilarious, but not merely funny. I got the impression of my refrigerator. Hopefully I'll come back to this later because I want to stay on point here, but I got the impression of my refrigerator. It's a white refrigerator. Vinyl surfaced, like many refrigerators. And it was deified. It was like this, angelic choirs and rays of divine light coming off the refrigerator, which is a very ridiculous seeming, to my rational mind anyway, completely ridiculous. And even to my, the Luddite in me that abhors machines, it doesn't merely abhor machines. I don't merely abhor them. I recognize that coupled with the insensate, dissociate, war and prisoneering monsters that have captured and colonized and are recolonizing our existing societies and nations and populations and so forth, those things are death sign. Those are the flags of a coming apocalypse, and not just an ever coming apocalypse, right? An apocalypse that's happening now has been happening for a good, depending on how you want to count it, 1,000 years, but much more so in the past 500 and much more so in the past 1 and so forth. A sort of a heartbeat of doom, where the humans just are ripping the foundations of their own minds to shreds in terms of the origins of the possibility of intelligence and consciousness in the anciently conserved ecologies of the planet, which are the most precious thing around here. Not us, our origins, the womb, this planetary womb that ever renews itself and hopefully doesn't really need to be penetrated in order to be fertilized, right? Light, the divine virginal penetration of light, sunlight, and time-space is the water of time-space penetrated by sunlight, coupled with the physical hypostases of these primordial, more than merely beings, generates life here. And it is truly holy. But as I was saying, those stars in the sky, they are not coherently related to one another, except by the angle of our perspective. They don't belong to some family of local anatomy, local stellar anatomy. I don't think. I suspect they're wildly distant from each other and would be seen completely differently from another distant angle. Say if we drew a circle around them, if we made a sphere around the Big Dipper at the same distance from which our perspective arises, we made a sphere, then we just traveled to different perspectives on that sphere, very different things would emerge to our perspective. And what I'm trying to say is that imagine that although your sort of spirit or soul, however you want to think about it, and there's much better ways to think about it than a spirit or a soul, the localization that you think of as yourself is probably similar to that Big Dipper. Imagine that there are many, many beings. We could start with a small number to make it easy. Let's say there's 12, just for kicks. And a couple of those beings are living in the Pleistocene, like the earliest time of the humans. And not all those beings are human, but we're going to pretend they are for a minute. And they're living in all different times and places of the earth. We're going to keep them on Earth for the moment, though that's not actually necessary either. So there's beings all throughout the historical phases of the humans, and let's say half of them are before you and half of them are after you. So 6 before you, and then you in the middle, that you're the 13th one, so to speak, and then there's 6 after you in the future. And those beings are all simultaneously existing, but you, the you-ness, the me, the me-ness, Darren, hopefully not the meanness, but the me-ness, you perceive yourself as localized in this temporal-spatial manifold of relationships, when actually you're a constellation of beings with a nucleus, much like what we think of as the solar system, right? And sometimes you're the sun in that family. Sometimes you're, Saturn. It's funny, we have this system where we establish your relationship between each of the planets, and everyone thinks, oh, that's a bunch of hokey. Well, those people who think that are very confused. But also the people who reify the system of astrology are just as confused, because it's neither false nor fact. Both of those extremes lose the fragrance of insight that is accessible to us as human beings. Once things become explicit and we start trying to say what is a fact, and unless we're in a very limited sort of cone of purposive orientation and behavior, there's an applicable scope to what we think of as empiricism. But let's be really clear, what the moderns mostly do with empiricism is kill. They use that to kill stuff. I remember my friend Fernanda from Brazil. She wanted to become a marine biologist until she discovered that what that meant was collecting living creatures from the sea and killing them, taking them apart, studying the bits. Of course, there are other ways to do it, but the classes that she was taking, she was magically in love with the sea creatures just as I am. Until she discovered what empiricism is about and what we do with it, which is really the wrong thing. And you can see again here the terrifying, jagged, pointy fingerprint of colonization. This is what I mean by colonization. I don't mean necessarily bad people, mostly men. And yes, men are the execution body of colonization because historically, primarily, at least in the large cohorts, men were the disposable soldier class. And there's so much here to look at. So yeah, men were the inaction body. And sometimes men, often perhaps men, were the the infected, dissociated, orienteering measurers, rulers, measurers of value, measurers of history and futurity. What does history mean? And what will we make of this potential of our lives and moment, of our cooperative potential? One of my new friends, Roger T., who I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, that's why I'm not doing it, who has this brilliant, sort of matrilineally communicated from his wife method of alignment, producing alignment in human cohorts, particularly in business, but not necessarily merely in business. Called us apex cooperators. It's a brilliant phrase. I'm not sure if he coined that phrase or who coined it. But so yeah, it looks like it was men. And I'm not denying that there's a problem with... I'm going to make a joke here. With having the, external three-part flower downstairs. Historically. But this measuring and what... The problem is that the males who perpetrated and executed iterations of recursive colonization were first themselves colonized. This is the thing we need to see. And we know, we have some I don't even know who I mean by we. Let's just say that culturally and sociologically, we have become aware as moderns that many of the people who perpetrate violence and subjugation and murder and rape and violation were themselves subjected to these deprivations and impoverishments and terrors in their developmental arcs. And it's not clear, to me anyway, that in a coherent or small-scale, coherent human family, tribe, culture, it's probably extremely uncommon that these behaviors emerge. And some will say things like, well, we've seen behavior like this in primates. Okay. But did you see primates before humans invaded the jungle and before... What is the human effect on the context in which the primates are developing? What is the effect of the humans of the human behavior in the world on the primate population? These features of that which exists are connected. They're not merely, we would ordinarily think, rationally, that if the monkeys are in a jungle in Africa where there are no humans, presuming there was such a jungle, and the humans are somewhere else doing things like making war and going insane together, killing up everything that moves and most of what doesn't, it wouldn't affect the primates until and unless the humans showed up in the jungle. Because we presume that there's no way to communicate the malignancy from the humans to the primates unless they're proximal. This is not true because there's always a dimension of the context where everything's proximal. The planet is a unified manifold of historical, relational, futurial transmissions, communication. So whenever I hear people saying, oh, it's just natural for humans to be, I don't believe it. I don't believe that at all. It's conceivable, but what it looks more like to me is an infection most of the time. And maybe I prefer to see it this way. Maybe I'm biased. Graeber and his writing companion in The Dawn of Everything push back against the idea that humans have been catastrophically misbehaving toward each other and life in general for thousands of years, and it's the law of the land and so forth. That myth needs to come down. I just don't trust it at all. But what I'm trying to get at is that the origins of the problems we face are not in the men. It's not merely patriarchy. And what has happened that's terrifying is that the features of our humanity that are vulnerable to colonization have been being colonized by something. And we can think of this something in a variety of different ways. For eons. And these colonizing contagions, these colonizing pathological processes. Oh wow, here's the dog man with so many dogs. And yet he can keep them all coherent. I need to have a chat with him at some point, because he's really profoundly skillful at managing a large group of unrelated dogs. Nearly certain those dogs don't come from one family, one household. So we have to look carefully into the histories, and not just the written histories, the histories that are submerged within us. It's my direct experience that not just the history of life on Earth and not just the history of the humans, but the history of what we think of as the universe and the history of its origins, the origin places and the origin beings, is encoded in the strata of our being. And this is recoverable to us whensoever and to whatever degree we may agree to recover it, to seek it, to quest for it, to inquire, as Amon Hillman, the half-mad prophet, tells us. He, in his linguistic neuromorphosis, tells us that the ancient languages are actually doorways into lost potentials of our humanity. And for the moment, at least, I'm not a big fan. What does that even mean? I have a large fan in my hand and I keep waving it. No, I find his playful and hilarious and terrifying, manic, manistheic, prophetic genius inspiring and nourishing and propelling. Yeah. But one of the things he says is that, and I may have this wrong, but he's saying something like the originary idea that becomes in our time the word history actually comes from bringing a question to the probably adolescent sibyls at the oracle places in the ancient world. And he's talking specifically about places in Europe and what we think of now maybe as the Middle East and Greece and so forth. Greece primarily, but also its surrounding, like the empire, I guess. I don't know where all the sibyls were. I don't know where we have records of them being, but what he was saying is that this idea of history, it's not stories about what happened, it's to become pregnant with the urgency of a question and pursue that question beyond our common inclinations to answer it, to declare some, oh, here is what happened. No. It's to become the re-happening, the living anamnesis of the question. And this is the kind of potential we are born to experience the exaltation of. And there's nearly no one like Ammon. You know, other biblical scholars or classicists may criticize him and say things like, oh, he's taking a specific sense of a specific word and he's promoting it to the primordial sense over all instances of this word in such a way as to twist the perspective, to produce the truly bizarre narrative that he wants us to swallow, right? About ancient Greece, the origins of Christianity, Christos, the Medusae, Medea, medicine, all these things. And hilariously, some of those critics, Dan McClellan among them, might be technically, linguistically, and perhaps even cognitively, quote unquote, correct. They're missing the point. They're missing the point. Amon's unique and you know, intoxicated, right? The elixir that Amon is making is cygenic, generative of mind states otherwise inaccessible. And they're looking at something, it's just like people who've only seen airplanes or jet aircraft, which are made for war or passenger or cargo transit. They're looking at basically they're looking at a UFO. They're looking at something from outside. It wasn't even made by humans. And it doesn't do the things that the human-made aircraft do at all. It has no concern about those things. It's concerned with transporting us to insight and reestablishing anciently lost relationships and correcting nonsensical histories that for us have become prisons of ignorance and blindness. And time will tell whether the elixir of Amon's performative, and I don't mean that in the derogatory modern critical sense at all. The elixirs of Amon's performances are truly generative of anamnesis and remembering. However, personally, I find them profound and brilliant in an admittedly iconoclastic and provocative way. So let's see if I can recover my threads here. The colonized colonizers. The recolonization. So now, what's going on modernly, okay? We have the rise of the internet, which starts out looking pretty virtuous. It resembles in potential the agora of ancient Greece, where Socrates and other philosophers, rhapsodes and sophists, perhaps, gathered the common people day to day to pursue wisdom and insight, but also to pursue convincing, right? Condemnation, indictment, judgment, opinioneering, right? And the internet began this way, but it was colonized, and it colonized us. And what was it colonized by? It was colonized by forces that advertised themselves as protectors. Okay? The NSA, National Security Administration, the ridiculous enforcement arms of the government that rose in the wake of 9/11, as if 9/11 were produced specifically to generate those recursively colonizing lethal organizations, and to create a future of panopticon-like surveillance that would collapse not merely the possibility of a free society, whatever that might mean, whatever that whatever it's possible for that to mean. But it would turn our own homes and relationships into prisons, weapons that we could be threatened with. And then with the rise of social media, which again in the beginning was a way to bring people together and to celebrate our potentials for intelligence and creativity and insight and play, quickly again became colonized by corporate agendas driven primarily by two forces: advertising, the absolute, one of the most malignant demons of our modern world, and governmental surveillance of citizens. These twin cyclopean, that's probably insulting the Cyclops, but these monsters, straight up monsters, that will eat our lives, minds, and children, and sell the bones to the highest bidder. So you can see this recursive, iterative recolonization of our relationships, our interiority, our thought, our dreaming, our bodies, our metabolism, right? And it's as if it's a layered antithesis to anamnesis. It's a layered, like an acid that just eats the foundations of memory and produces structured skeletal remains that are commoditized and turned into the fuel for future iterations of new forms of recolonization. It's easy to distract us with indictments that make little sense. If we're actually concerned about the injustice of the histories of colonization, slavery, misogyny, misanthropy, misbiorelation, abiotic omnicide, then we need not so much to indict and prosecute the histories. We need to understand the origins, and we must establish coherent vessels for our communal development, education, anamnesis, healing, enrichment, and something, what does decolonization mean? We can imagine it means something like, when the children have lice, you put medicine in their hair. No, we need to do the opposite of, both things maybe. We need a very enlightened idea and direction for any such project. And it must be it must iteratively decolonize itself.
Whenever I say to myself out loud, I'm going to pick up 5 pieces right now.
That was really beautiful, what that guy was saying. So he was saying, this guy's really interesting. He's clearly a not ordinarily minded person, because he has an enthusiasm that's far beyond what ordinary people would usually have, right? And he was saying, the last few times I told myself as I was out on my walk, I'm going to pick up 5 pieces of litter. Each time I found a pair of expensive Ray-Bans, or one I found $100. Every time I found something valuable. This is kind of what this is a strange sort of synchronicity. if our orientation is indictment and prosecution, the path is too expensive and will continue to colonize itself. And one of the ways it will do this is with nomenclature. Actually, two of the ways. No, it's like the Spanish Inquisition. Every time you look, there's more ways. Right? But yeah, it's with nomenclature, in other words, jargon. And it's with ideology, ideological fanaticism. So we have to be aware of those. We have to be aware of the way that a purposive orientation that starts out virtuous and altruistic in a trustworthy sense is easily captured even by the threads of its own origins. And so we have to find a way to preserve the possibilities of virtue, insight, learning, healing, growth, so forth. Just the terrifying machine signal. And then the horrible noise of death. Every animal that ever heard that was soon to die. Our cells know this is this is the bell of doom. When you hear the engines, almost. I mean, there are a few exceptions. There's a few exceptions. I guess the engines of the ships of the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, for example, are an unusual inversion of that paradigm. So what I'm trying to get us to remember here is that all of the executors of colonization were almost certainly victims of colonization first. They were infected with the Thrisp-like structure of processes that would convert them, their lives, their children, their ancestors, the meaning of their origins and the shape of their future to omnicide. Dead terrain, the production of commodities, the collection of commodities in the coffers of the powerful and the wealthy, who are themselves sort of the seed bed, the dead inside seed bed of the pathologies that become the inaction body of the colonizing forces. And we must discover, and I mean, I think I have some keys to this, which I have spoken of in the past, but we must discover and recover the origins of the problem. And clearly,
Is that what you did? You gave him crackers? Is that what the honker was about? Look how fluffy his cheeks are.
okay, I think we just got a clue here. So these geese are flipping out, and the males are getting all spun up. And they're getting spun up because a human gave a couple of them some crackers. It'd be hilarious to discover that, like, that one of the origins of the problem of colonization, and I think there's probably a lot of evidence, quote unquote, for this, is simply the introduction of carbohydrates. Once you can store up huge amounts of carbohydrates, it's sort of like what happens when you put a nectar bottle, a bottle of dyed sugar water, in a population of hummingbirds. They might have been a little bit provocative before, but once you put all those commodities in one place, now you got two problems. You got to protect them from people who might want to take them, and it's a really attractive prize because it represents what? Convenience. Okay, so we're going to see two things here: fuel and convenience. And there's a third thing, which is essentially metals, particularly what we think of as precious metals, and jewels, crystals, diamonds, gold, silver, platinum, copper, bronze, iron, diamonds, emeralds, rubies, sapphires. So, and I'm not even getting close to what is actually going on. These are the later stage catalysts of devastation. What did they really want when they sent ships to the New World, quote unquote? Well, they wanted gold. Yeah. What were they after? Gold. They might have been thinking land, but mostly they were thinking gold. Did those savages have gold stored up somewhere? Let's get that gold. Or at least this is the story we tell, and that story is probably 3/4 wrong, but it maybe resembles our own projections. And projection is a large part of the problem because if you think your opponent is up to something nefarious, then you have to get there first. This is the race to the bottom, the perverse incentivization elucidated by Daniel Schmachtenberger and others of the Game B or New Civilization project. What has to happen, obviously, is that we have to establish some options that are so much more compelling than the zero-sum competitive pathologies we're currently enacting and being conscripted to and punished by and devastated for. We aren't the people of the lie. We are the generation of lying. It's different, right? The context is so catastrophically, multi-layeredly toxic, counterfeit, projective. Everywhere we see presentations that advertise virtue, and underneath are essentially self-purifying disease vectors. And this is, the concept that I use. This is the origin. My quest to understand this resulted in a series of visions, one of which introduced the concepts of the cognitium, which is the network of human minds, the mimula, which is all the features of connection in that network, and thrisps, which compete for dominance of that network under conditions in which the organic and natural orienteering principles that would guide and nourish and protect our collective insight, memory, intelligence, altruism, virtue, when those break down, boom, thrisps everywhere. It's similar to certain biological processes like those that burn down our neural networks with prion proteins, for example. One of the things, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, or otherwise known as mad cow disease, and similar prion protein disorders. As I understand it, the prions are essential to the differentiation of our nervous systems and neural networks in the brain in early development. Similarly to how something kills off the flesh between our fingers so that you get these differentiated, very useful, articulate appendages. Something resembling that happens in the brain in our early developmental arcs with neurons. A lot of them have to be burned off. And what that means is that's one of the things that makes us each unique, because we all undergo this kind of interior extinction event, and usually we think, oh, extinction is bad. And it certainly is if we're burning down anciently conserved ecologies to make more machines and stuff. That's insane. There's nothing coherent or biorelationally integral about that. That's just madness and wrongness. And yeah, you can take the bigger picture. Sure. You can say things like, oh, life is resilient. Earth is resilient. But I'd love to see where that perspective is arising from. Because if it's arising from some kind of empirical or materialistic perspective based on what you think is the historical data and so forth, that's dissociative. That's dissociated. You're not connecting with nature at all. You're just being a disembodied, grasping rationalist. So you're almost certainly going to be wrong about nearly everything having to do with organisms, if that's your anchor in consciousness and concern. A mother's concerns, much more trustworthy. She bears children. She has to fund them. She has to build their bodies from her own biology, right? The calcium of her bones, the metabolic products of her body, her heartbeat becomes the context in which life emerges. And while our planet is only metaphorically feminine in this sense, that metaphor goes very deep and is very powerful. It's not merely a figure of speech. So we must recover the origins of the problem that led to our defection from memory, humanity, insight, virtue, mutual intelligence, mutual concern, awareness, our real cooperative abilities. And we must find ways to establish vehicles to conserve, develop, enact, and transmit, communicate these potentials into the existing bodies of anti-culture that largely own our species at this time, our children, and perhaps we may be so lucky as to stumble into ways of being human that please our ancestors by fulfilling their dreams and what they hoped for and worked for in the deepest recesses of their hearts, minds, and spirits. All of us moderns, and for, millions of lifetimes, we have been slaves to things that don't even exist. We have been slaves to ghosts and shadows in the human cognitium, presenting as virtues or progress and delivering omnicide, amnesia, torture, despair, the devastation of our spirit, our communality, the replacement of that with prisoneering, panopticon-like surveillance systems that aren't killing us off directly at the moment. And this is actually part of the problem with the weird results of technology. There are fates worse than death, and some of them involve the slow erosion of our interior assets and potentials. And if you can get at the thing with which we tell the difference, the thing with which we would otherwise notice what is happening, then anything that gets at that, anything that gets at the fundamental basis of our capacity to discern change, right? If you can co-opt that, then the entire bank of the history and future of life on Earth, of human beings, of our interiority, is now open for rape. And you can get away with anything you can imagine. You just have to go slowly enough. You just have to turn the heat up in the water slowly enough that it doesn't overcome the disabled senses that would alert us to, we must oppose this. Yeah? That would organize and galvanize us into communal, into heroic communal organization, intelligence, resilience, and activity. So these are a few of the things that are in my awareness today, or have risen in my awareness while I muse with you, my listeners, in the hope of better ways of seeing, in the hope of anamnesis, in the hope of pleasing the ancestors and the muses, and perhaps the angels. I'm so grateful to have this time together, and for your kind attention, your enthusiasm, your wonder, your curiosity. The spirit within you of heroic questing, recovery, and rescue that is innate to our human nature. May your ways and minds and dreams be beautiful and healing and profound. And may you find joyful relation with all the aspects of yourself, your histories, your futures, your ancestors, your progeny, and all of the beings who are in fact a single family. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.